We've produced videos that refute Eastern Orthodoxy and its false doctrine known as Palamism. Palamism is the heretical idea that in God there's a real distinction between his essence and his uncreated energies. It comes from Gregory Palamas, and our videos cover it. Palamas is considered to be a saint in various sects of Eastern Orthodoxy, but he is not considered to be a saint by the true church, the Catholic Church, as we will see. Palamas was, sadly, a heretic. Since some people still wrongly think that Catholicism is compatible with Palamism, and even that Catholics may venerate Gregory Palamas as a saint, I want to show in this video that the veneration of Palamas was forbidden before Vatican II. I also want to cite various pre-Vatican II theologians who recognized and denounced Palamism, just as we do, for the heresy that it is. Father Joseph Pohl, who died in 1922, was a founding faculty member of the Catholic University of America and a contributor to the Catholic Encyclopedia. He wrote many things that were published with an imprimatur before Vatican II. His manual on theology was used in many seminaries. We're not saying that Paul was infallible or correct on everything. He was not. But he was learned, and he was absolutely correct on this issue. Here's what he says about the Eastern Orthodox Palamites and their doctrine. He rightly calls the Palamites heretics. This is from his work on God's knowability, essence, and attributes, which was given in imprimatur in 1910. Quote, 2 centuries later there arose among the schismatic Greeks the heresy of the Palamites, so called from its author Gregory Palamas. This heresy 2 Constantinopolitan synods, AD 1341 and 1347, did not blush to proclaim as a schismatic dogma. The quintessence of the Palamite error may be stated as follows. Between the essence, ousia, and the activity, energeia, of God there is a real distinction, inasmuch as the latter radiates from the former as something inferior, though still, in a sense, divine. According to them, God's different attributes are merely radiations of the divine essence, and they solidify, as it were, by taking on the shape of an uncreated but visible light, which the blessed in heaven perceive by means of bodily vision. It is the same light that the disciples beheld on Mount Tabor. Here on earth, this heavenly bliss is possible through anticipation only, as the fruit of severe mortification, in the stillness/quietness, that is, the repose of contemplative prayer. Hence the name Hesychast, hence also the contemptuous nickname Umbilicans, given to these heretics by Barlaam, the learned abbot of St. Saviour's at Constantinople. Except between the divine hypostases or persons, no real distinction can be admitted to exist in the Godhead, because if there were in it any sort of real distinction, the divine essence would consist of distinct parts, which is repugnant. St. Bernard of Clairvaux justly traces this erroneous view to polytheism." End quote. In yet another passage, Paul refers to the heresy of the 14th century Palamites, who alleged that the divine attributes can be contemplated separately from the divine substance in the form of a garb of light enveloping the Godhead. As we can see, Paul articulates the same position that we do, that is, Palamism is heretical and Palamas was a heretic. Even though its adherents try to deny it, Palamism is tantamount to teaching that God is composite. That logically results in polytheism. That Palamism is tantamount to teaching that God is composite, which is heretical, is clear to anyone who is familiar with Catholic teaching on this subject, is familiar with Palamism, and is honest and faithful to the former. Anyone who tells you that Palamism is compatible with Catholicism either doesn't know what he's talking about, or he is dishonest and compromised. Another pre-Vatican II theologian who recognized that Palamism is heresy was Father Martin Jugy. Jugy was one of the most learned men of his day on matters that pertain to Eastern Orthodoxy and Palamism. He was professor of dogmatic theology at the Pontifical Oriental Institute in Rome from 1917 to 1952. Jugy considered Palamas to be a heretical innovator. He said that Palamas' system is undeniably a novelty in the history of Byzantine theology. He said that Palamism gravely adulterates the notion of God, leading to monstrous errors. Norman Russell, author of Gregory Palamas and the Making of Palamism in the Modern Age, called Jugy's position on Palamas the dominant Catholic line at the time. So the dominant Catholic position before Vatican II was that Palamism is a heretical novelty and a monstrous false doctrine. Jugy also described the Palamites of the 14th and 15th centuries as those who conceive of God in an anthropomorphic manner, that is, in a manner of having human attributes, and place in him a metaphysical composition of substance and of accident. Since Palamism is so clearly opposed to Christian truth about God, Jugy believed that a proper analysis of it was a powerful way of demonstrating that Eastern Orthodoxy is a false religion, and he was correct. People need to be converted to the one true faith of Christ, the traditional Catholic faith, to be saved. Jugy also notes that Palamism's origins are to be found in the false mysticism which began to seep into Byzantine monasticism, roughly about the time when the Byzantine Church itself broke the last links which had connected it to the Roman Church. Gregory Palamas invented a false doctrine of God in an attempt to conform God to his false mysticism and pride. There are some liberal heretics out there who claim that Palamas didn't teach a real distinction in God between essence and energies, but only Scotus's formal distinction. That's nonsense. Note, I'm not endorsing the formal distinction of Scotus. I'm merely stating that Palamas went way beyond Scotus's formal distinction when articulating his novel position. As Paul, Jugy, and others correctly recognized, Palamas taught a real distinction in God himself between essence and energies, and that is tantamount to the heresy that God is composite, as we've shown in our other videos. Any honest person who reads the Triads or the 150 chapters of Palamas and knows what a real distinction is, will see that Palamas teaches that there's a real distinction in God between essence and energies. In fact, on this point, Professor Simeon Valhay of Constantinople, in a 1909 article that was published in the Catholic Encyclopedia, stated that Palamas, quote, held that in God there was a real distinction between the divine essence and its attributes, and he identified grace as one of the divine propria, making it something uncreated and infinite. These monstrous errors were denounced by the Calabrian Barlaam, end quote. The same author in the same Catholic Encyclopedia article goes on to say that the conflict began in 1338 and ended only in 1368 with the solemn canonization of Palamas, that is, by the Eastern Schismatics, and the official recognition of his heresies. He was declared the holy doctor and one of the greatest among the fathers of the Church, and his writings were proclaimed the infallible guide of the Christian faith. 30 years of incessant controversy and discordant councils ended with a resurrection of polytheism, end quote. So this 1909 Catholic Encyclopedia article correctly identifies Palamism as heresy, a monstrous false doctrine, and one that leads to polytheism. The author also notes that the false doctrines of Palamism were officially recognized by those Eastern Schismatic sects, which is another clear proof that those sects are not of the true Church. Here's an interesting quote from an Eastern Orthodox writer who summed up some of the pre-Vatican II opposition to Palamas. Quote, the Jesuit Francois Richard translated into Greek his work in which he accuses Palamas of heresy. He calls on Orthodox Christians to burn his, that is Palamas's triads, as well as the service to Palamas. In 1635, Denis Petot called the teachings of Palamas ridiculous doctrines, and among those that agreed with him were the Latin-minded and the Uniates. Meanwhile, the Greek students at the College of St. Athanasius in Rome were pushed to anathematize the anti-Latin saints of the Orthodox Church, such as Palamas, end quote. Denis Petot, who called the teachings of Palamas ridiculous doctrines, is described by the Catholic Encyclopedia as one of the most distinguished theologians of the 17th century. These condemnations of Palamism by theologians before Vatican II shouldn't be surprising when you consider that Palamas, among his other ridiculous doctrines, taught that there are some energies that have a beginning yet are still uncreated. That is blatantly heretical, for every Christian must believe and profess that whatever begins to exist is created, and that God is immutable in his divinity. If God begins to have new uncreated energies, then he is not absolutely immutable in his divinity. But the councils declare that God is immutable in his divinity. Read the Council of Nicaea or Ephesus or Chalcedon or Athanasius, and you will discover that anything that changes is created, contrary to the heretical assertion of Palamas. If you defend Palamas's blatantly heretical teaching that there are some energies that have a beginning yet are still uncreated, which he sets forth more than once in the Triads, then you are simply a fool and a heretic. Palamas also taught that the, quote, uncreated energies are exceeded, surpassed, and transcended infinitely by the divine essence. Obviously, therefore, they cannot be the same God. We could give other quotes, but these should suffice to show that people before Vatican II who were familiar with these matters and faithful to Catholic teaching, at least on the doctrine of God, rightly recognized that Palamism is heresy. But what about the fact that in the post-Vatican II period, Palamas is venerated as a saint by certain people who claim to be Uniates? That is, certain people who purport to be members of Eastern Rite churches that profess union with Rome. That's a practice of the Vatican II sect, which is not the true Catholic Church, as our material covers in detail. People need to know that Palamas was venerated by certain Eastern schismatics shortly after his death. When some of those Eastern schismatic groups converted to Catholicism, they unfortunately did not remove the veneration of the heretic Palamas from their calendars. However, in 1720, an important provincial synod of the Uniate Church was held called the Synod of Zamość or Zamostia. The decrees of this 1720 Synod of Zamość were confirmed by Pope Benedict XIII in an apostolic constitution, as Pope Pius XII points out in his 1945 encyclical on the Ruthenians. Well, this 1720 Uniate Synod of Zamość suppressed the veneration and even the mention of the name of Gregory Palamas. As an Eastern Orthodox author writing on the subject of the Ruthenian Eastern Rite in the 16th and 18th centuries noted, quote, "The Council of Zamość, 1720, decreed that the veneration and even mention of the name of Gregory, Palamas, be prohibited in the Uniate Church." End quote. That's what the true Catholic Church thinks of Palamas. He is a heretic, not a saint. It was only in the 1970s, after Vatican II and under Antipope Paul VI, that the veneration of Gregory Palamas, which was rightly condemned by Catholics before Vatican II, was reinstated for some who use Eastern Rite liturgical books. Since the Vatican II sect is not the Catholic Church and Paul VI was a manifestly heretical antipope, as our material covers in detail, the reinstatement of the veneration of Gregory Palamas after Vatican II of course has no validity for true Catholics. The fact that the Vatican II sect honors the heretic Palamas, and Antipope John Paul II went out of his way to praise him as a saint, is just another example of why it's not the true Catholic Church, but the prophesied end-times counter-church, the Whore of Babylon. What is happening in Rome now is in fulfillment of end-times prophecies about the beast and the Whore of Babylon. We plan to do more videos that deal with different aspects of this topic, but please consult our previous videos for a clear refutation of Palamism. One of the things that we showed in a previous video is that the letters of Pope St. Agatho, which were accepted by the Third Council of Constantinople, crush Palamism. In Agatho's letter to the Emperor, he teaches that whatever is stated essentially of the Trinity, such as will, operation/energy, power, glory, etc., refers to the one divine nature. That contradicts Palamism, which asserts that the divine attributes, the uncreated energy, glory, etc., are not the divine nature. Likewise, in the letter of Agatho and the Roman Synod of 125 bishops, which was also accepted by Constantinople III, it is explicitly taught that the one divine essence or nature is the divine glory, the essential will, the essential operation/energy, etc. That totally refutes Palamism, which teaches, among other things, that the divine attributes, the uncreated glory, and the uncreated operation/energy are not the divine essence or nature.